Bueno, muchas gracias. Vamos ahora a tener la sesión final del día. Y ya sé que estamos en la hora un poquito de cansancio, entonces lo que vamos a hacer es vamos a cambiar un poco el formato. Vamos a tener 3 presentaciones rápidas, cada una de unos 15 minutos, y luego un par de preguntas para cada una de las presentaciones. Lo voy a estar moderando yo, ya que el moderador que teníamos asignado, Gustavo, no pudo acompañarnos hoy por el tema del clima. Entonces, primero que todo, el tema es el fortalecimiento de las GFS, perspectiva extrarregional. El primer presentador que voy a invitar es a Sean Daugherty, jefe de la Secretaría de la Red de Relaciones Fiscales entre niveles de gobierno de la OSD, que vino desde París para acompañarnos. Entonces, si quieres, Sean, puedes subir y hacer tu presentación. Gracias.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here for the second annual conference. We're very excited that this type of network is being created in Latin America. Beyond the OECD, we also have been developing a network in Asia to also share similar practices. And actually, funny enough, the theme that we chose for this year's annual meeting is almost identical to yours, looking at local capacity development in particular. A little bit less from the financial management side, and more from the kind of governance perspective. But these kinds of concerns are really of the top level of concern in many regions of the world. At the OECD, governance concerns remain a top priority in most OECD countries, even when they've reached some of the most advanced levels of development. I'm going to start with a very quick overview of some of the stylized facts and the way that we think about and measure decentralization and the assignment of responsibilities. I think this is an important aspect of thinking about fiscal relations, is really getting the information clear and in a comparable way. Country systems vary in many important respects, both in terms of the assignment of responsibilities, the revenue, the tax side, and of course the more institutional aspects are even harder to capture in numbers, much less more qualitative, substantive aspects. When we just think about the OECD itself, it's already quite large, although it doesn't look so large on the map. There's quite a diversity of different systems. We have about 35 member countries at this moment. I don't think that includes Colombia, which is set to join in any day now. We have 9 federal countries in the OECD, and most of those are members of the fiscal network. There's also a large number of unitary countries, some of which are very decentralized. Sometimes they're even more decentralized than some of the federal countries. Denmark is a case in point, and you'll see on the next graph that they are in the far upper right-hand corner when you try to measure decentralization in terms of public expenditure at the subnational level, which is quite remarkable in many respects. The only other country that comes close is Canada, where provinces have a very substantial degree of autonomy. And then on the other end, on the bottom left-hand corner, you see that well, a lot of smaller OECD countries are highly unitary, highly centralized. Now, that's probably also based on their small scale, but it's not always the case. In some cases, countries just have chosen different arrangements and have traded off various degrees of either economies of scale for autonomy or other aspects. And we can even group different models into different categories in the OECD context, and there's quite a bit of diversity across different groups of countries. You have some that are, well, at the very bottom, they're type 4 on this mapping, that are, well, not very decentralized and have relatively low subnational tax revenues. These include Greece, New Zealand, Ireland, Chile, even Turkey and Portugal, which participate in our fiscal network. And then at the other end, you have highly decentralized and which have relatively high tax revenues, even to the subnational level. As I mentioned, Canada and Denmark. You also have Sweden, Finland, Germany, the US, Japan, Spain, Switzerland, Australia. Particularly interesting case, which I'll say a few more words about. Other countries are somewhere in between. Just a broad stylized fact, we do observe that through the course of development and with increasing per capita GDP, the countries generally tend to become more decentralized. They choose it, let's say. That doesn't mean that there's a causal relationship. There are some relations and some causal relations we do find in some specific sectors between decentralization and increasing growth, but it's not a deterministic relationship at all. If we look at over the past decade or so, we can see that there has been a broad trend towards decentralization in quite a few OECD countries, with a majority of them having increased their decentralization of both taxes and spending, but there is also some reversion on the other side of the coin. And then at the same time, we also find that most countries tend to decentralize spending quite a bit more than revenues. So this was the motivation, I think, of last year's conference, that we stylized fact that includes most Latin American countries, that that often subnational governments don't have that many tax levers. They don't have much spending and revenue authority or tax autonomy, depending on how you want to think about it. And that's very important because they're also responsible for many important public services, and particularly in the areas of education and health, as well as other types of social protection. And so this raises an important dichotomy and often some kind of a mismatch of incentives, which should be of substantial concerns to policymakers and is the center of many of our discussions at the Fiscal Network annual meetings in Paris. Let me then just go through a few of the key challenges that have been identified in the course of either country reviews or in our cross-country comparative work that we found in many OECD countries. Well, one of the key ones, which I think is the most relevant and where we're doing a lot more work, is unclear assignment of responsibilities across levels of government. So this is something that's, I think, come up quite a bit today, and I think different very concrete ways of addressing them through specific IDB programs and country programs have been discussed, but these are issues that come up again and again, and in many OECD countries, and I would say maybe even most vividly in the health area, where often a hospital has to deal with many different levels of government, both local levels of government as well as central levels of government, for different parts of the decision process. And to make matters even worse, often there's overlapping responsibilities, so decisions can't be made autonomously or very quickly, and that can lead to some important distortions and inefficiencies in the delivery of health services, for instance. And so we've looked more closely at these issues. We're looking at a lot of work on the public sector performance issues right now in our analytical work supporting the Fiscal Network. And, well, these are things that are of great concern. Beyond this, functional responsibilities tend to be not always very consistent across sectors, even within countries. Sometimes you have asymmetrical decentralization where municipalities with quite a bit more, let's say, larger scale, perhaps more technical capacity, they often are given more autonomy. In some ways this is good, but it often can result in some, I would say, uneven assignments and unclear degree of governance, which can lead to some concerns about implementation. And, well, to make matters even more worse is fiscal autonomy often is not adequate to fund these services. So then they have to be funded through various types of grants, and often they're earmark grants, and we find that earmark grants tend to be not as good as block grants in terms of implementation. A lot of countries don't feel that comfortable just giving the money away, let's say, to subnational governments, and so this is, there's often a lot of concerns about the design of particular performance contracts, and this is something that we're having a special workshop on in Paris next week, where we'll be discussing the experience of a number of governments that have had better experiences, let's say, with performance-based contracts and conditional contracts. These include the United States, Australia, as well as the European Commission, and they'll be sharing some of their experiences, and also some countries that are, I think, seriously rethinking how they do things, such as India, where we actually carried out a quite targeted workshop earlier this year. There's often a lot of unfunded mandates in many countries, and so they may say, you know, local government, you're responsible for delivery of public services in the healthcare area, but then not give them any resources to do that. And this, of course, can cause massive problems. And so a lot of the reviews have just identified these sorts of problems. And then it can lead to the central government doing a lot more ad hoc transfers to try to fill gaps. But then it can really damage incentives, as I think we heard from Teresa and Etienne earlier today. And then I think in a lot of, especially particularly small municipalities and smaller subnational governments, you have lack of skills and institutional capacity, particularly in countries that are at earlier stage of development. So technical capacity building efforts may be highly warranted. And then there's always coordination challenges across levels of government, whether horizontal or vertical. And often those can be facilitated by central government programs, such as, that include the ability of information technology to facilitate the sharing of information. I think the example we heard from Brazil was, I think, quite an interesting one of an example of that sort of effort. Monitoring and data collection is fundamental. It's fundamental within countries, it's fundamental across countries. Otherwise, it's very hard to benchmark and understand better what works and what does not work. We've carried out some new work in the fiscal network context, looking at the assignment of specific areas of responsibilities across 5 different sectors. And this is just an early look at some of the work that we've done there that shows that, in fact, if you look at different aspects of the system in terms of whether you're looking at inputs, budget control, output control, monitoring, that sectors vary quite widely. And actually, healthcare is relatively centralized overall in terms of actual control over the expenditure in the system, even though it wouldn't look that way from purely an expenditure perspective. Education, on the other hand, is more decentralized, but it's a bit more, I would say, spread across levels of government in terms of the different parts of the system. And then if we look at social housing, it's sort of inverted and even more spread out. So we're going to be doing more empirical work on these areas going forward. We've actually already done some early studies on both education and healthcare. Let me just skip ahead to, no, I won't skip ahead because it's too many slides. How do I go back? Is it the red one? Yeah. I'll come back to that point. Where tax authority is decentralized, there's often tends to be autonomy over rates and reliefs. I think we heard earlier that it's often, central government tax administrations often have the technological and the institutional capacity to actually collect taxes in an effective way. And I think it's maybe even more important in countries that I would say don't have such a large taxpayer base, or whether the scope for evasion is higher. And relying on that, but still at the same time being able to give subnational governments levers and control over their tax rates and improve the capacity of those administrations to both have the authority and the responsibility for the delivery of services is critical. And so we see within the OECD context, quite a few countries give discretion over both rates and tax reliefs within their jurisdictions. However, actually, there's still a lot of variation across countries, and it's not just between federal and unitary countries. We see quite a lot of differences between countries, with, of course, federal governments giving more authority to subnationals in terms of the levers or tax handles, let's say. And, well, property taxes are perhaps the most fundamental of the subnational government taxes, and they require, I would say, well-developed land registries and valuation systems, and I would say put a particular emphasis on valuation systems, and this is something that's incredibly difficult. I think there's been a number of important comments throughout the day on this, and, well, it's not an easy problem to solve, and many advanced OECD countries still struggle with making these systems work effectively, often because, as this figure shows, the blue means that it's 100% local tax. And that means that often central governments don't really have even the motivation necessarily to get so involved. And so really a collaboration between perhaps central governments that have, I would say, the technical capacity, and local governments which have maybe the incentive, if they were given the right tools, is often warranted. And maybe finding some solutions, whether it's in the design of the property tax, which can sometimes address some of the political economy concerns, because often the phase-in of property taxes is a big fear, and then the capacity to pay. Often there are some designs of taxes which can include actual income as well as the value of the property. So people may be property rich but income poor. You can take an account of that in the design of the taxes, and this may be a more realistic way to approach it. You can also start to converge to some, the rates. You don't have to throw them in all at once, because it can be a massive social shock if you were to just, jack up property taxes overnight. And then often taxing the land separately from the buildings can be very effective, and having higher rates on the land that can encourage good land use development, and it may be even easier to administer. And then there's also always equity concerns. Fiscal equalization programs are widespread. Australia has a particularly interesting example, and they've just gone through a very comprehensive review of their program. I'd highly recommend having a look at the Productivity Commission of Australia's recent review of the horizontal fiscal equalization program. They look a lot at the incentives and design of that program, and I think it offers a lot of lessons. And let me just conclude this initial part on just some additional observations. I mean, clarity and assignment, I think I said quite a bit about. Strengthening institutional capacity and governance. This includes the tax autonomy as well as the actual government incentive structure and human resource side, and the coordination mechanisms. And as I said, looking at public sector service delivery is fundamental, and this is an area that we're doing a lot of work, and this is the figure I wanted to jump ahead to, which was looking at healthcare. The early empirical work that we've done shows that, in fact, when you decentralize healthcare provision on a typical system-wide basis, you gain lower expenditures overall and higher quality. So this sounds like a win-win proposition. That's going from fully centralized to somewhere more decentralized. However, and that's the fishtail on this, if you get too decentralized, everything reverses. So you get higher expenditure and worse quality. And so I think this is a very interesting early finding of our newest work in the area of healthcare, and it's an important warning. So, and it also explains, if you look at actually, you talk to healthcare policymakers, you find that a lot of countries that have gone in very far in the decentralization area actually are now re-centralizing key elements of their healthcare system. So I think this is quite consistent with the sort of policy landscape there, and so it does suggest that there's a kind of good in-between point that you should seek. And let me just conclude with some key lessons from OECD work. This is based on a review of the past 10 years economic survey chapters that looked at regional policy issues and the decentralization, fiscal federalism type concerns. One of the key ones is to better align subcentral spending with own source revenue. This is very much the same kind of idea that you align the responsibilities, you align the resources, and so that a particular level of government is responsible for both raising the revenues from the population as well as delivery of service to the same population. So there's much more ownership and responsibility. And delineating responsibilities and functions clearly, raising spending power and tax autonomy, and reducing the scope of earmarked grants, as I mentioned at the beginning. Strengthening internal markets. The private sector, I think, plays an important role in reinforcing the overall, I would say, resilience of these types of policies, as well as sometimes choosing to assign some responsibilities to private sector providers. And finally, strengthening intergovernmental information and coordination systems, which is also about data sharing, having good IT, having very good and effective fiscal management. Let me stop there. I'm happy to take questions. I have a couple more slides if any particular questions come up.
Gracias, Sean. Vamos a tomar un par de preguntas para Sean en este momento.
Thank you. Very provoking presentation. I found interesting the fishtail that you showed on health. I'd like to know what's your take on why is this going on?
Yes.
And is this part of a publication that is out there?
Yeah, so this is based on a new empirical paper that we commissioned with colleagues that work in our healthcare division of the OECD. It actually combines work. We initially did commission some work looking at microdata of hospitals. Unfortunately, we have access, I think, only about 9 countries' microdata on hospitals so far. But in fact, that data also has the same direction, although I would say it's with less confidence, and the tail is not so clear. I would say the fish is quite clear. In terms of the basic fish, I would say we find that, well, I think, I didn't say that much about benchmarking systems, but I do think they play an important role here. When you decentralize services, you often facilitate good competition across subnational regions. And I think that's an important mechanism. And to the extent that you have good information available and it's transparent to the public as well as to the government, it can foster competition. So if hospital intake rates or exit rates, cost per service are extremely high in one state, people are going to say, what's going on there? And central government's going to say, maybe you need some heavy intervention to try to improve efficiency. And Australia's done a lot of this, and I think that's a really interesting example. This evidence comes actually at the overall health system level, this particular fishtail. And there we have a full range of all OECD countries in the sample. We have 3 waves of a health characteristics survey that captures many different institutional features of the health system, which we're able to control for. And then we were able to measure decentralization with about a dozen different characteristics of different parts of the system that can be decentralized. And here I think we're just seeing that essentially when you go in the direction of, say, from fully central to a little bit more decentralized, you start to get some of those advantages through good competition, which are reducing expenditure and increasing quality. But then when you go too far, I think you just start to lose control over some of that, and and perhaps you also start to run into capacity constraints.
Vamos acá y luego allá.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, normally typically when we talk about local revenues, we talk about property taxes, movable, mobile, all the classification that the OECD has, but do you have, or are you going to include in this report and the OECD work some aspects about the revenue that comes from public services and goods? The type of income or the revenues that local, state goods and public services generate, and if there's something specific about that. Also, local and subnational state enterprises. You don't want to say not only water, but some transport or some depends on the size of the city and the size of the local government, right? Thank you.
Absolutely. Actually, we've recently put out, I don't think I have a copy of the publication with me, but it's available online just a few months ago, a publication on fiscal decentralization and inclusive growth. And there we include some empirical work looking at, well, the cross-country experience of different types of decentralization and very specific channels. And this actually differentiates out both taxes, different types of taxes, as well as actually fees. And I recall that it's not that large a share of the overall subnational revenue in most countries. However, the coefficient was very positive. So it's one of the exceptionally strong results that I think we found, that to the extent that the subnationals use fees, that's actually very pro-growth. And actually, at the same time, it's actually a win-win in the sense that it's also pro-equity. So it has some very nice features.
Okay. Y la última pregunta por el momento, por favor.
Hi, my name is Julieta. I'm from Brazil. I'd like to know if you have studied the limits of decentralization and if it is a sort of this limit can still improve efficiency and avoid all kinds of deviation. Okay.
Okay, let me go beyond the fishtail and to a final slide here. So this was also in the recent publication that we did. The result I just mentioned was in Chapter 2. In Chapter 3, we have another cross-country study that looks at the channel of globalization and how it interacts with both spending and revenue decentralization. And we try to look at both growth and equity effects. And one of the things that we find, it's probably a little bit hard to see in this figure, but I encourage you to have a look at the chapter, is that, well, you find a very wide range of decentralization experiences across the OECD. I think you saw in the introductory slides, just countries all over the map, even within the OECD. If you extend, it's even further, broader range of experience. What we found that was particularly interesting, and what we did in this empirical approach that we took, we were actually able to look at the marginal effects for particular countries in terms of whether it was growth enhancing or the reverse. And we found that despite some countries being at different places on the map, it was very country specific, and actually globalization played an important role, because I think that affects the kind of net scale that a country achieves. And so globalization is kind of a scale-enhancing element, which may change the point of sort of positive or negative growth enhancing, whether the coefficient is positive or negative. And so we really couldn't say specifically whether, while we find that decentralization is growth enhancing overall, for individual countries, as many as half of the countries are already too decentralized. And so that they actually should be re-centralizing. And then, well, you have another half of countries which are maybe still too centralized and could decentralize more. And I think, and we found an important role to play of how integrated they were into the global trading system as well as other aspects. And I think Brazil probably faces an important, they weren't in our sample because it was based on just the OECD database that we currently have. But I think it might be interesting to look at sort of where similarly large, relatively close countries might fit. I do believe they're mostly on the left-hand side here, which shows a slightly, well, a more positive potential for the role of decentralization, perhaps offsetting the fact that it's relatively closed. And at the same time, on the equity side, slightly more negative for equity-type concerns. Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much.
Muchas gracias, Sean. Ahora voy a dar el paso a una charla de Emily Brock, que es la directora del Centro de Enlace Federal de la Asociación de Oficiales de Finanzas de Gobierno de Estados Unidos, mejor conocido en inglés como el GFOA. Así que, Emily, te invitamos. Emily va a hablar unos 15 minutos y después vamos a tener un periodo corto de preguntas y respuestas. Gracias. You're welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm Emily Brock. I'm the director of GFOA's Federal Liaison Center. And interestingly, this conversation has been fascinating for me. My job is to advocate on behalf of local governments to the federal government. It's to tell the local government story to the local governments. So I do want to apologize up front. I don't have a video of amazing infrastructure or of wavy beaches, but I have written down several locations for my next vacation, so thank you for that. On behalf of our 19,680 government finance officers across the United States, I look forward to the prospect of forging new partnerships and exploring new possible grounds for future cooperation and synergies. Today, I prepared a presentation for you about our organization, the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada, to let you know what we do, how we operate, and how we work to promote excellence in government finance. The mission of our organization, it's a pretty easy slide, is to advance excellence in financial reporting. Whether that's in budgeting, or in auditing of financial statements, or in disclosure of debt information to our investors. A lot of folks were talking today about margins. We talk about that. We cover that. We address all fields in order to provide the government finance officer the tools that they need in order to provide infrastructure and to provide essential public services that their citizens need. So for over 113 years, which is actually kind of shocking to me when I mentioned it to someone in the hallway, we're over a century old. So we've been advocating on behalf of local governments for quite some time. GFOA is always focused on the professional management of governments. And the products and the services that you see listed that we provide our members are designed specifically to achieve our mission, which is to promote excellence in financial reporting. So our members participate in various ways. They are volunteer participants that drive the content of our products and our services, which I will describe throughout this presentation. But importantly, and I want to emphasize this, we are a nonprofit, non-governmental organization. Our membership consists of about 19,680 members who are mostly non-elected, that is, they're civil servants, they're administrative personnel in local government finance, and we do have a small margin of members who are in state finance. Between our two offices in Chicago and Washington, D.C., the GFOA only has 55 employees. We actually only have 4 employees here in Washington, D.C. So we run a very tight ship. We try to ensure that what we do is fiscally conservative so that we can advance and promote our mission on behalf of our members, who, by the way, help our budget run. So I did want to talk a little bit about our budget. Thought it'd be helpful to start the presentation with our 2019 budget, which is budgeted at $16,593,000. Our expenses are largely centered around the administration of our organization, that is salaries and maintenance of our properties. But our revenues are largely derived from 3 major sources: annual membership dues, registration fees received from training events, and review fees for our certificates of award is in excellence. The diversification of these revenue streams allows our organization to seek additional ways to serve our membership. So whether it's through providing subject matter expertise or through providing federal lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C., that is, pay for my salary, our members appreciate the complementary services that we provide. So as I mentioned, the largest source of revenue is our membership fees. Who are our members? Jurisdictions join with a fee related to their population size. If you're a larger jurisdiction, you pay a larger fee for membership, but you get more bodies into the organization. You get 10 memberships. If you're a smaller jurisdiction, you get fewer memberships, but you pay it based on your organization size. The vast majority of our members, as you can see, are actually the chief administrative officers of their organization. So we're talking to CFOs or CAOs, those who are decision makers at the ultimate finance level. And we're proud to represent a wide variety of members coming from all over the United States. We do have 300 members in Canada. It's a smaller portion of our organization, but they certainly drive a different perspective on public finance. The diversity of our membership helps us to better understand and address the needs from very large organizations, like, for example, of course, we have the state of Wisconsin and the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority. I'm sure you guys have ridden the subway in New York. The CFO is our past president, so I work regularly with him. It allows us to speak to that size of jurisdiction, but also to Pataskala, Ohio, a town of about 1,600 people. So we have members that span the gamut. As you can see from the chart above, over half of our membership is in cities, but we don't qualify that between cities, towns, and townships. So it could be very large cities all the way down to very teeny tiny towns. About a quarter is from counties or more rural jurisdictions across the United States, and an eighth, or about 12%, and I heard on one of the previous panels, 12% of our membership are actually service districts, so water authorities or transportation authorities, because they too deal with the public budget, with the public fisc, and also can issue public debt in our municipal bond market. Lately, we've experienced growth in school districts, interestingly, because school districts as separate governmental units sometimes act independently from other governments inside of the United States, so they're called ISDs, independent school districts. And they too have asked for excellence in fiscal reporting and have a constituency that they need to serve. So we've seen a large growth year over year in our school districts. Having this type of diversity in our membership allows us to ensure that our communication and our recommended best practices can be applied by all levels of jurisdictions in the United States. So every other year, GFOA conducts an annual review of our membership, first to understand who they are and how we may be of service to them to help achieve excellence in financial reporting. In each survey, we ask them to identify key challenges as finance administrators. And what we found, this may not be surprising to you, what we found was that one of the key concerns, actually the top two ranking, is revenue. A second concern is infrastructure, which, as you know, is a ubiquitous conversation here in Washington, D.C. Doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you are talking about infrastructure. So we also found that benefits administration is especially important due to the economic downturn and also interesting investments that were made. So an upkeep of the pension and healthcare administration. And then lastly, we noticed our members identified attracting qualified staff as a key concern. And we acknowledge that these concerns are not a comprehensive list, but rather they're a roadmap to help us address their challenges in promoting excellence in governmental finance. And I did want to mention, on several panels, I noted that trust and transparency is also a major concern in IDB countries. And I did want to say that that also made our list. It didn't make the top 10, but certainly trust and transparency is a major concern for municipal finance officers as they continue to work with their state and their federal partners. Since one of the major concerns is revenue generation, we have to be on our toes to ensure that the federal government does not preempt local taxing authority. A free benefit to our members is the advocacy work that we do here in Washington on their behalf. It's fairly common, actually, for larger jurisdictions or states to have their own offices inside the Beltway. They hire lobbyists who go and do their bidding and speak and make relationships with their state and House of representatives. But for those who do not have that benefit, GFOA keeps an office of about 4 folks here, policy experts that go and consistently talk with the Hill about local government concerns, and especially our concerns with the federal government preempting our revenue generation capacity. Perhaps what we're best known for among our members in federal agencies and beyond is our maintenance of our 88 best practices in the various fields of public finance. I've highlighted up here our 3 most popular as determined by clicks on our website. But these are completely free resources. They're available today to you if you go to gfoa.org. We have all of these best practices that are not only generated by our organizations, but they're maintained by our organization. You can imagine that if you put out a best practice and you walk away from it, obviously behavior changes. You may have to revisit it. It's an iterative living document. And GFOA best practices identify specific policies and procedures that contribute to improved government finance. They aim to promote and facilitate positive change or recognize excellence rather than to merely codify what people are doing. So that's an important part, is that 25 members of a committee are getting together and saying, what are we doing that's good? And what do we need to tell the world that they should be doing when it comes to budgeting, when it comes to fiscal policy, when it comes to debt administration? And so we maintain these best practices as a free and open resource to the world. An additional way our members strive to achieve excellence in financial reporting is to receive our certificates of excellence. Many promote receiving the award. I've noticed a lot of tweets lately. If they get it, you know, the whole budget office is standing up and they take a selfie and goes out to the World Wide Web. We got the Certificate of Excellence in Financial Reporting. And that gives us a lot of great pride, and it gives them a lot of great pride. Because they're able to say, look, we are not just abiding by accounting standards. We are going beyond the minimum requirements of generally accepted accounting principles to prepare CAFRs, or financial information, that evidence a spirit of transparency and full disclosure. Those are our metrics for sending out a certificate of excellence in public finance. And we continue to maintain this program. This has actually been going since 1945. So we have a lasting brand that lives in our municipal finance offices across the United States. So about 60% of our members are CPAs, which, as you know, is a rigorous testing process with international appeal. I mean, you have the CPA, you have to maintain your ethics, your technical, you have to remain and maintain categorically those things which make you a CPA. But if 60% of our members are CPAs, that means 40% are not. And so those 40%, and some of the CPAs have actually said, you know, I don't know that accounting necessarily makes me certified to understand finance across the enterprise. And so they asked us in 2003 to create a certification supported by CPEs, or continuing professional education. They asked us to create a program that tests in 5 general public finance areas: budgeting, debt, treasury, pension, and I'm missing one. Of course I would. So you've got 5 general areas of public finance that each one of these members who are testing into the CPFO program are being tested on. Not only that, but they also have to maintain CPEs in order to maintain their CPFO. So what you see in our organization is an emergence of a new certification, which is recognized by our members who hire through our website. So jurisdictions will come to our website and say, I'd like to have a public finance officer, and I would really like for them to have the CPFO designation. So it is certainly a way to enhance and reinforce our mission, which is to promote excellence in government finance. And in order to maintain these professional credentials like the CPFO and the CPA, as I mentioned, you have to get CPEs. But also, in order to maintain those CPEs, you have to conduct training and you have to receive credentials for that training. GFOA actually has a series of national training that occurs across the country. Next week, we're going to have national training in Florida. The week after that is Chicago. The week after that is California. These are in-person trainings where members come and they learn about various topics. We have various training that occurs in these jurisdictions, and people can come and they can take them. And in general, for each class that we give, we get about 50 to 100 people, or 50 to 100 municipal finance officers attending the national training. This is in-person training. But of course, nothing is more convenient than training at your own desk in your own jurisdiction. Am I right? So we have gotten into the world of webinars. Actually, I've been in the world of webinars for about 15 years. And we actually offer several programs which garner more than 5,000 registrants. So our GAP update, which is our annual accounting update, has had about 5,000 registrations for this year. And our Better Budgeting webinar has about 1,500 registrations. And those numbers are actually great. Those are great because it allows them to get their CPE certifications from the convenience of their own desk, and we are the ones who can provide that information in order for them to maintain their professional credentials. But possibly our most important training event is our annual conference, which occurs once a year. This year, we're very happy to host our annual conference in Los Angeles, California, where participants can engage in networking events and they can go to general sessions, but importantly, if you go to Los Angeles, you can get 20 CPEs. So you have an opportunity to be there, an incentive to be there, talk with other municipal finance officers, apply those best practices that we have, and then also be able to earn those 20 CPEs. As additional complimentary service to our members, we offer scholarships for first-time attendees, which means free registration for about 50 members from each state and each country. For those members who can't attend training or maybe can't attend one of our in-person conferences, we also contribute to the academic conversation pretty regularly, whether it's publication of information in response to congressional activity like the tax reform bill from last year. We had a fair amount of publications come out of that, but also member-driven publications. So if members say, you know, I'd really like to talk about lien, we have a research group that goes forth and conducts that research. So we usually have about 12 publications a year, but of course it depends on how crazy the activities of Congress are of the previous year. So I noted also one of the key challenges of our member survey is the selection and recruitment of talent. We are really lucky to be endowed scholarship funds. And those scholarship funds are specifically tailored to give to potential students who are interested in the field of public finance. So every year we award $90,000 in scholarships to young future professionals in local government finance. And it's fascinating because it's an incredibly competitive program. I mean, we're seeing applications in excess of 1,000 applications per scholarship. And so it's actually quite heartwarming to actually see that much enthusiasm in local government fiscal management. So finally, I wanted to be sure to mention the strong, lasting partnerships we maintain with similar organizations in countries all over the world. Throughout the past 20 years, we've built up strong partnerships with members in other countries pursuing the same goal, which is excellence in government finance. Our first step in establishing partnerships is to talk with the leadership of those countries to ensure that a partnership is beneficial to our combined members. If so, then we actually establish a formal partnership which encourages an exchange between leadership so that, for example, our president-elect went to South Africa this year and their president came to St. Louis for our annual conference. The partnership also allows for training opportunities between countries, and it provides for peer-to-peer networking at our annual conference. Now, importantly, we've learned a great deal from these partnerships, and we've achieved great success for our members. And we've confirmed that by maintaining these partnerships, we achieve excellence in government finance together. And importantly, we recognize that excellence in government finance starts at the local level. And so with that, I wanted to stop. I hope I haven't gone too far over, but we'll be very happy to take questions.
So I think we'll take a couple of questions. ¿Alguien? Sí, por favor.
I'm going to make a question that is not a lot related with the content. I want your opinion about the the change included in the fiscal reform approved for Trump administration in December 2017, especially two measures that affects the subnational governments, that are the taxes section for state and local, and the another is the personal deduction that it puts a cap. I don't know what is the opinion of your organization about that.
Oh,
measures.
we've got a lot of opinions about that, yeah. So late last year, the last 45 days of last year, I didn't really get much sleep, largely because the number one pay for in order to achieve the $1.5 trillion that made reconciliation happen, made the bill go through, was to eliminate this state and local tax deduction. And as OECD noted, I mean, property tax is a huge factor for revenue in local governments across the United States. But also, so is sales, and so is income tax. Okay, so those three triggers were the three triggers that we were talking with the Republican Congress about. And we said, look, sure, there are high tax areas. People kept saying New York, New Jersey, California. But what we found was that this is actually a tax system that evolved over 100 years. For over 100 years, the local tax systems were set up first, then the federal government came along and set up their tax system. So we argued we were there first. And what we found was there was actually high SALT districts in Northern Virginia, in Minnesota, in Ohio, in Texas. And if you look at the election results, those are the Republicans that lost their seats. So we're having these conversations right now about the state and local tax deduction and what the impact of a $10,000 cap means on Republican control. But also, another way that they got that $1.5 trillion was to eliminate personal deductions. And at the same time, we can't necessarily advocate for or against personal deductions because, again, I represent local governments. But if I walked in as Emily Brock, I know which way I would advocate. So another way that the tax reform, I just want to say really quickly, another way that the tax reform really hurt state and local governments was the elimination of what's called advanced refunding. And it was like an opportunity for state and local governments to refinance their debt. The Treasury allowed us to refinance our debt 18 months prior to the call date of the bonds. Well, they took away that capacity. They took away the ability for municipal governments to save money on debt issuance, which is infrastructure. It's still gone. We have a bill that's outstanding in Congress right now, and we're looking for co-sponsors. But there were multiple different ways that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act impacted local government fiscal management.
Thank you. I'll take one more question in the back, please.
I'd like to know a bit more about the partnerships you have with other countries. I saw in your list you mentioned South Africa, Brazil, and so on. And these are countries with a very different reality of the USA. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to know how this partnership works, what issues you cover in the partnership, like zero-based budget or so on.
Yeah. So, well, generally, there's a lot of conversation about revenue generation and revenue capacity, but also not just in taxing authority, but in fee structures, as was mentioned in a prior panel. So those are, revenue generation is definitely a similarity between us and our international partnerships. When it comes to accessing the debt market or debt levels, we can talk about private bank debt and how it's utilized, but of course we have the municipal bond market, so it's a little bit different. But what we do is we I listed Indonesia, and that's a really casual partnership. We call each other all the time and just kind of talk about our challenges and whether or not they can relate. And in fact, Indonesia and South Africa are much stronger together than we are, so we kind of make those networks happen, or at least we try to.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we're going to leave it at that. So the last speaker of the panel and of the day and of the afternoon, Etisham Ahmad, que es profesor e investigador senior del London School of Economics y del Chinese Academy of Fiscal Science. Welcome.
Thank you. It's always hard to be the last speaker of the day, standing between you and dinner. And the question is, why China? Why are you interested in China? The fact of the matter is that China is a super interesting case study. It's a laboratory. And I was asked to talk a little bit about how international agencies have interacted with the Chinese reforms and how the Chinese government have used the international agencies. So that's the angle I'm going to give it. I'd also say that this is a work in progress because China at the moment is facing a major structural reform, one which I'm actually involved with. So I can spend all day talking about China, but I'll be selective and give you some ideas as to the history. Now, I think when you talk about China, you have to realize that it's come from a very different context. For about 2,000 years, China did not have a central tax administration. And it relied on appointing officials. The emperor used to appoint officials that were totally decentralized and share money upwards. And as a matter of fact, that was the way China operated well into the 1980s. And the re-centralization by Mao, by sending out the Red Brigades, actually didn't work. So what Deng Xiaoping did was to let the local governments have their say, told the private sector or told the state-owned enterprises, just keep your profits. We're not going to take 100%, we'll take 30%. Told the farmers, pretend the land is yours, and we'll give you international prices. Don't worry about ownership. So essentially, it was a reform of fiscal responsibility, of decentralization, but that reform had a major impact on the public finances. So by the early 1990s, the tax GDP ratio in China had fallen from 30% to 10%. And the central government share, which used to be half, had fallen to a quarter. So Beijing was only getting 2.5% of GDP. And in the early 1990s, they saw Soviet Union disintegrating. And they came to the IMF and said, well, what do we do? And the IMF responded by saying, well, you need a central tax administration. And they said, fine. But the World Bank said, why don't you first fix your spending assignments? And that's where the first big tussle took place. And essentially what the Chinese did was to go with the centralization on the revenue side. The National Tax Administration was designed to manage a modern tax system, which is the VAT, completely from afresh. There was no compensation given to individuals, but there was a problem, and the problem was they were taking tax powers from the provinces. And in order to take tax power from the provinces, they had to compensate the provinces. So they had a lump sum transfer to the provinces to make sure everyone had 1993 level of revenues for perpetuity, forever. Then they gave a share of the VAT. That benefited rich provinces. Then they brought in an equalization system, which benefited the poor provinces. And then they did something which drove the World Bank mad. They said, we're going to give money back to the regions where it's generated. The idea was to create the hubs for employment. And the World Bank said, no, there's going to be inequality increasing. You need to put the development money in the interior and the south. And they said, no. We don't have the connectivity. We can only put it along the coast, which is where the money is generated. And really the consequence was that they grew at 10% per annum for 25 years. What happened with the VAT reform is that the tax share going to Beijing went up immediately to 50%. And then the tax GDP ratio over time increase to around 20%, which is where it is today. And that's what's necessary to meet basic SDG requirements. Now, what actually happened was that you had a very good political economy situation. They were looking at gainers and losers across provinces. This is also what the Mexicans learned from in 2007 and 2013. You need to make sure that the provinces do not lose when you bring in major tax reforms. Very important principle, not individuals, provinces, because provinces vote in Congress. And really what they had was major support from the IMF. The IMF helped a lot with the policy, with the design. We held conferences in Shanghai, Qingdao. We had technical assistance missions helping them with the establishment of the tax administration. And unfortunately, the World Bank didn't make such good inroads because they wanted a completely different strategy, which was spending assignments, which was a traditional theory, fix your assignments and then do the financing. That was what the nominative theory said. They turned it around, went for the revenue first, and I supported it, and Zhurongji, I think, and others, it was essentially Lou Jiwei who coordinated this work, were right. They had no choice. They had to do it this way. And the consequence of that, of course, is that the public finances strengthened. They had money for investment. You had essentially the coastal hubs, which provided full employment. You had 150 million people move to these coastal hubs. 700 million people came out of poverty in these 25 years, which is the bulk of poverty reduction in the world. It's the bulk of poverty. It's 750 million in the world, 700 were in China in this 25-year period. That's the result of their fiscal reform. So they were not worried so much about compensating for this tax or that tax. They were saying we're going to create full employment. So the focus was employment generation. Now what they have today is a problem of success. They didn't have a complete VAT. Initially, they started off with the investment type VAT. They did not give credit for capital purchases. That came much later. It was incomplete. It was split, like in Mexico. They looked at the Mexican reform in 2013, 2015, they integrated the VAT, exactly the same as Mexico. The idea then was to complete the value chain, and by completing the value chain, you actually reduce the cost of doing business. And you provide information. You provide information on where the production and assets are being generated. So they expected a revenue loss. The revenue went up because with the VAT reform, you had an impact on the income taxes. So the total tax GDP ratio went up in spite of giving credits and integrating the VAT. So that was really quite substantial. The problem is that these coastal hubs have become too big. When I first went to China in the mid-1980s, Shenzhen was a fishing village of 150,000 people, and Guangzhou was a god-awful place. Now Guangzhou is 15 million, a wonderful city. I can show you photographs, but we just don't have time. Shenzhen is almost 20 million people. Tech hub, marvelous infrastructure, and that's really, with the completion of the VAT reform, they removed the boundary around the special economic zone. The idea being that the problem with the special economic zones is that they were useful when the enabling environment was bad. When the enabling environment has been properly integrated, there's no need to have a boundary around the special economic zone. You want the linkages from the high-tech zone to create a bigger high-tech zone. So that's exactly what they're doing. So they're creating a bigger Silicon Valley, which integrates Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Zhuhai, and then also eventually Hong Kong and Macau. So that's going to be 80 million people doing high-tech innovation. That's their new strategy in that area. But the focus is to move people away from the big metropolitan areas into smaller, compact cities. Now, how do you do that? The problem with the reform is that when you complete the VAT reform, there are no tax handles left at the local level. Now, one of the Other reforms that the IMF in particular, and myself, and thanks to Teresa, have been involved with is budget and treasury. In the mid-1990s, after the success of the revenue sharing reform, they called me up and said, you know, we are responsible for grain silos, Ministry of Finance. We don't build it ourselves, you know, we can't build grain silos. We give the money to provinces, but we don't see any grain silos being built. I said, that's the problem with your budget system. They then did one of the best treasury single account systems anywhere in the world. Treasury single account, the national level, and linked treasury single accounts at provincial levels. They then went for the full GFSM framework, 2001, and then updated to 2014, initially on a cash basis, but moving gradually, and from 2015 to include the full accruals. So they now require all local governments to produce balance sheets. This is well before Europe. France only did it last year. The Chinese have been trying to do this since 2015. And the reason why this has become so important is because the Chinese were not allowing the local governments to borrow. The budget law said no local government borrowing. But they could set up corporations that did borrow. And these corporations just borrowed an enormous amount of money. The idea was this would produce a golden rule, but as a matter of fact, they were used by the local governments to do everything. And then in 2009, there was a 4 trillion stimulus program. Again, they had to use these special purpose vehicles, which led to huge expansion. And of course, the debt overhang now is tremendous. And a large part is not known. So that's the problem in China, is that they have a huge subnational debt problem, which is partially unknown. And they are facing the need possibly for a major stimulus. So how do you do a stimulus when you already have a debt overhang, especially at the local level? That's a big problem. The other problem is that China was fairly equal to begin with. But over time, and this is a province of Zhejiang, which is one of the richest in the country, huge differentials, particularly in service delivery, huge differentials. And one of the things that they did not do in 1995 was the spending reassignments. They're doing it now. They had social security being provided at the, not even at the provincial level, at the local county level. So there were county level pools. Of course, how do you manage a social security system at the county level when you have an aging population? It's not possible. And the result you see here, they have no tax instruments. They rely on transfers and revenue shares. And you have huge income spending disparities in the richest province. And what that tends to happen with the revenue transfers, they come and stick in the capital cities. Nothing goes down below the capital city. So the further down you go, the worse it is. And you have huge pressures and fiscal pressures building up at the lowest level of government. So that's their problem now. And they are now beginning to centralize Social Security. That's a reform for 2019. They're beginning to rationalize the other spending assignments, which they did not do in 2015. The problem is that they don't have any own source revenues at the local level. And that's a problem. So Guangdong, again, is a problem. But you're creating new urban structures. How do you make an urban structure financially viable? They've done the high-speed trains. They've got wonderful connectivity. Airports, highways, the best in the world. These high-speed trains, the US has nothing compared to them, even better than Europe. They're fantastic, but it has not solved the income distribution problem. Income distribution problem is partly issue of the tax system. The income tax is not working. It's a tax on wages, as it is in Mexico. Then you have triple taxation on wages because you have high payroll taxes, you've got income taxes, which actually add to that. It does not tax the upper tail, which is non-wage income. And for that, you need a property tax. You need something which gives you a handle on assets. Now, they tried the property tax, like what you talked about in the Brazilian case. They tried to do it in Shanghai. They have fantastic information. Satellite information, mappings, et cetera, et cetera. They're way ahead of everything we're seeing here. They couldn't do it. It didn't work in Shanghai and Chongqing. So that experiment failed, and that failure is actually rather important for you to look at. Why did it fail when you have all these preconditions you were talking about? Didn't work. So that's one thing that's quite important. What are they doing now? Well, that's work in progress, and we're discussing with them alternative models for taxes. Now, of course, the connectivity is there, but there is still a problem of creating the new hubs. It's like creating new hubs in the south of Mexico. You want to create new hubs in the west of China, in the Rust Belt northeast. And, you know, part of it is a question of public investment, but also the local taxes to provide services. So many of the hubs are not in the poorest regions. You allow people to migrate to where these people are. Now, I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude by saying that the public financial management system is very good at the national level and the provincial level. They have treasury single accounts, they have standardized reporting, which again is something that Mexico could look at, and virtually every other country in Latin America. They have properly defined charts of accounts, they have balance sheets, they're not fully populated the further down you go. That's work in progress. But they don't have own source revenues at the subnational level. The mistake that was made by our friends in the World Bank was to allow local governments, they changed the budget law in 2015, to introduce a local government bond system. Now, you do need a local government bond system, but you can't have a local government bond system before you have own source revenues. The mistake was thinking that revenue shares and transfers are own source revenues. They're not, because they cannot be increased in order to meet the increase in spending that comes about from the payment of debt. So that was a problem, and it did not solve their problem, because they still have a debt overhang and the huge risk with subnational debt going forward. So really that's, you know, there isn't enough time to go into the various issues. There's a question of how they use performance indicators. Again, performance indicators, you have good information, but if you don't have full information on the balance sheet, and especially on debt, the performance indicators are biased. So you have to be very careful about what it's good to have them, but you need to know the full cost of these service deliveries. So really, you're looking at a completion of the national tax agenda, which includes using the property tax to expand the income tax, and a new form of property tax, which can be done simply just using the registration, linking the access to public services to the people who actually live there without causing a revolution, which could happen if you force everything to market values. So really you're looking at the overall picture. I don't have time to go into, but in conclusion, really, it's own source revenues. At the subnational level is public investments. It's looking at major coordination of debt limits, coordination of investment, and then monitoring of liabilities. So really there is a major action plan going forward. The ADB is helping with the FMISs at the subnational level. You wanted to know what they're doing. They're doing largely that, plus helping with some performance indicators. They're also helping with thinking through, and I was asked to go by the ADB to China to help to prepare the inputs into the 14th five-year plan. And that also links up with the research program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Any questions? Please.
Professor Edson, congratulations for your excellent speech. I have just one simple question, maybe with a complex answer, but how would you compare the Chinese experience of fiscal restructuring with the Brazilian fiscal system? And more specifically, what Brazil should learn from China?
This is something that we've been thinking about for a while. Teresa and I were in Brasilia just a couple of years ago, just thinking about the coordination issues. What lessons are there? Indeed, the question is, can Mexico learn from China, and can China learn from Mexico? And to be honest, there's more to learn from each other than from the United States, because the United States is very special, or Europe. So looking at the political economy of reform, which is gainers and losers among state. The fact that you can't just carry out a reform in one instrument, that's a lesson from Mexico. So Mexican finance minister tried to fix the VAT for 20 years, or tried to fix the income tax for 20 years. None of those things worked because you have gainers and losers with every individual instrument. You can offset the gainers and losers by bringing instruments together, by bringing the taxes together and bringing taxes and transfers together. So if you are facing a major reform, and Brazilian governments have been trying to fix the VAT now for as long as I can remember. It's dysfunctional. Clean VAT, like what Mexico has achieved, or China has achieved, actually. Mexico is moving in that direction. India is moving in that direction too. Is because that creates a unified economic space, reduces the cost of doing business, and provides information to stop cheating. Hugely important. But how do you do it? Because you've got gainers and losers among the states and the cities as well in Brazil. That can only work if you look at the whole set of tax instruments and taxes and transfers together, and then do a lot of empirical work to work out, make sure that nobody loses. This was the big lesson from China. They did a lot of work to make sure no province lost, and that you had gainers in subsequent 50 years. So you're looking at 25, 30 years ahead, looking at growth agenda. You're looking then at financing that growth agenda. How do you do it? And then what are the instruments at the national level? How does that fit in with the instruments at the state level? Look at Mexico with the vehicle tax, the tenencia. Just giving it to the local governments, a good thing to give to local governments, but it collapsed because you had essentially a race to the bottom. So now, you really do need to look, and that was in 2010, before this major reform. It should have been part of the reform, but the outgoing government didn't want to touch the subnational tax instruments. But so the whole subnational tax agenda remains in Mexico. It's there, and it hasn't been touched. Similarly, when you do the major national tax reform in Brazil, you have to look at the subnational implication. And what do you give to the subnational? Maybe the property tax, the way you're describing it, works. Maybe it will work in some cities, maybe not in others. So, there may be asymmetrical options. Now, Bogota, I believe, has transformed itself from the early days. I was there in Mocos's time, leading an IMF technical assistance mission, when he was designing the Autovolua system. And it worked very well initially. Now what you're doing with the big data sets is actually quite interesting. But can that be replicated in other cases? The UK has that information, but they haven't been able to make it work. They actually abandoned the valuation system. So really, will it work in China? Well, it hasn't in the experiment. Will it work in India? We have some doubts. Now, there may be options in Brazil that from Fortaleza, which I thought was very interesting, that could be generalized, maybe not. But that's an empirical issue. You have to look at that. But that's the way to go, because then if you have a tax base, then you can link it to access to credit. And that then provides a very strong incentive for local governments. But also, if you have a tax linked to occupancy, that's hugely important for the informal sector. So if you want to bring the informal sector into the major tax net, give them access to public services, the fact that and this is very important in China as well, the fact that they're paying something gives them access to credit, gives them access to local services, which is hugely important. So really, the agenda is taxes and benefits. And you need empirical work on how these taxes and benefits come together. At the LSE, we've had the tax income and distribution project of Atkinson, Stern, and King since the 1980s. And the whole idea is to bring these instruments together and see how they work in the given institutional framework.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, if there is one. So I think that we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much. And now Huáscar has a final comment for the day.
Es simplemente agradecerles a todos por el compromiso, por participar en todas las sesiones. Hemos tenido una jornada bastante intensa. La jornada de mañana va a ser un poco más ligera. Vamos a empezar igualmente, pero a las 9 de la mañana y tendremos desayuno desde las 8 como hicimos hoy día. Por favor, no se olviden traer sus badges para que puedan acceder rápidamente a nuestras instalaciones y muchísimas gracias por todo el compromiso y la participación durante todo el día. Gracias.